I read, Miss Bobert, that when you were appointed to your chair in 2001, you were the first woman at the theological faculty since the University of Kiel was founded in 1665. I haven't looked at the website yet, but I hope that the composition has changed a bit now. Ms. Bobert has various additional qualifications, especially in the pastoral psychology area, was a clinical chaplain at the Charité in Berlin for some time, and she does coaching and has even developed her own approach, her own concept, which is called mental turning point and is based on mystagogy. We are very excited to see how we can further develop our personality through mysticism this evening, dear Ms. Bobert.
We can define mysticism in different ways. In today's culture, it is very popular in the context of wellness, or as a relaxation technique, or to send troublemakers and managers back into the treadmill so that they can quickly get fit again. So we have a welcome concept of mysticism as a bathtub, or as a cosmetic box, or as a repair kit for society, for contemporary culture. My concept of mysticism comes from traditional monasticism. Of course, I didn't just concern myself with Christianity, but also with other hermits, monks, and nuns. And there is my mystical concept of training consciousness through exercises, which is usually called meditation. Above all, it is about exercises that free our consciousness from clouding, which can be feelings of struggle for survival or fear, from illusions, from projections, for example, that God is always somewhere outside or will come back on the clouds at some point, or even from fantasies. Particularly radical is imageless mysticism, which also questions concepts of God. I locate myself in the mystic strand. If you meditate yourself, for me it is the so-called Christian Jesus prayer or heart prayer. But that is the same basic technique that some people know from the writing Cloud of Ignorance. And Cloud of Ignorance was spread primarily by Christian Zen followers, such as a writing from the 14th century. The greatest mystic from the early days of Christianity, who I particularly like, is not just Meister Eckhart. Hardly anyone knows his name anymore. Evagrius Ponticus died shortly before the year 400, and his timing was quite good because a tension between mysticism and contemporary culture became clear even then. Evagrius and this early Christian imageless mysticism in general stood in the theological tradition of Origenus. So that is the so-called Origenist dispute. And in the course of this, the imageless mystics were driven out of the desert by military force before the 4th century. On the other hand, those who worshipped God in images and in cult objects were allowed to stay. So we see again a mysticism that will suit the culture as a bathtub, as a relaxation hall, as a repair, which will not be so radical. You can still tolerate it. The goal of people like Evagrius or the imageless mystics, at least in Christianity, is theoria. That's actually the opposite of theory today, but rather by training your own mind, your own heart, seeing the truth live, i.e., not letting others tell you, for example through television or newspapers, which fortunately didn't exist back then. Theory. Aristotle's point is that theoria is noesis noesios, when consciousness sees itself. So we could say that it is self-recognition and consciousness, and in the horizon, God and consciousness actually merge with the same adjectives, formless and shapeless. Here the mystics say that they unite with the ground of being, which is at the same time creative. So my mysticism, as I now try to live it somewhat, not just read it, is really about this radical exploration of the foundation of humanity and reality. I'll combine this introduction with two approaches to what you can do with mysticism, so we can build them into the culture. In my view, you can only do this if you decapitate mysticism, i.e. grab the top, and in my view, that is the betrayed revolution, also the betrayed liberation of man. This misses the point by a hair's breadth. So that this bathtub mysticism, this repair box mysticism, this cosmetics, wants to make something beautiful about it everywhere. On the other hand, like these early Origenists or Meister Eckhart, who did not have a completely happy end to his life, I represent the second form of mysticism. It revolutionizes culture. She is concerned with the revaluation of all values, and her theme is, among other things, the integrity of what the culture understands as education. At the core of their criticism is that the mystics not only know something but also live something about the nature of human beings. So you want to develop your actual potential. And they always say that the reality you are dealing with is very moving, very colorful, but that is not reality. So we also know from directions such as symbolic interactionism that culture is very much a symbolic reality. So a lot of it is based on convention, in role-playing games, in systems, in constructs. From the point of view of the mystics, no matter what the contemporary culture is, the culture is reeling as long as it does not know the essence of human beings. Between disorientation, even if she is very moved, numbness, or a tendency to unconsciousness, they always say, you're sleeping, wake up. Religion plays in this system between culture and mysticism, let's say at least. Now I almost said bigoted role, let's say ambiguous role, or ambivalent, or even more delicately put, iridescent. On the one hand, religion cannot exist if it does not say something about the core experience, a mystical core experience that knows what is reality and what people can do. Otherwise, religion wouldn't exist. And on the other hand, as Karl Barth, a Protestant theologian, once said around 1920, it tries to turn lightning into a hearth fire. He was also a critic of cultural Protestantism. Of course, mysticism is latent in every religion, in every church. At least we hope so. But what is latent cannot necessarily be found in the shop window. So they don't automatically get that in confirmation classes or religious education classes. You have to dig quite a bit. The mystics, on the other hand, were often granted a peaceful cultural coexistence when they lived far away from nature, in forests, on mountains, or behind monastery walls. They can cultivate their specialist knowledge and not interfere too much with the culture. On the other hand, mystics like Meister Eckhart, who then tried to make this widespread in the culture, somehow got lost. That's a popular term. The mystique was lost. Because I come from East Berlin and was close to the civil rights movement, I was banned from studying, so I also had a lot of contacts with civil rights activists, and I know that they didn't just get lost. If something is political, it ends up in prisons. Writings are not distributed properly, or what one would say today, with Null Neumann, Spiral of Silence. There is still a very exciting article in Wikipedia about Null Neumann, the word Spiral of Silence. So mysticism, if you look closely at church history, was not lost, but rather it is a political issue. Someone goes around questioning the culture. Above all, culture is usually a culture that works in hierarchies, above and below, and the mystic is the wild, free, self-sufficient person. So what remains for mystics who are very involved in society? The title of nerds, fools, clowns, crazy. And I think that's a pretty good position. The benchmark for mystics is the question of what is essential about human beings. Of course, we can do a lot of things with ourselves. And the most important thing, I'll now take a digression to explain something that is fortunately very widespread in the culture now, is the knowledge about near-death experiences. Whoever had it says wrong word. I have never felt more alive. That would have to be based on life experience. So it's so vitalizing, it's actually forced enlightenment. So achieve the goal of meditation with a wild card. So if you want to know what the essence of life is, ask people who have had a near-death experience. Fortunately, there is also a lot on the internet, on YouTube. And they always say it's terrible, I didn't want to go back. This is precisely the gap that mystics try to bridge. And now you can do the trick and say, yes, that one thing is transcendent. Yes, that somehow science is still reluctant and says either too much oxygen in the brain or too little. The brain makes its own drug carrier. Every argument is used as much as possible. Unfortunately, there are also shared deathbed experiences. So if you ever read the book, it's a lovely, easy-to-read paperback and I love it. Moody, the one with two O and Y together in the light. This is an age-old theme, shared deathbed experience. When a person who is simply full of love, open-hearted and present sits with a dying person, they are sometimes drawn into their near-death experience. The friend now has too much oxygen in the brain, too little, or is on a drug trip. That's why the book is so great. So the argument is now invalid, but they really experience, wow, the room is not a room at all, but everything is full of light, it expands. Space and time are only temporary categories, and the dead are not dead either. Ultimately, if you know Star Trek, you will feel like you are on the holodeck of Star Trek. Yes, I don't want to use the word Maya now, but at least then you will know that what is initially heard as the ultimate reality here, like a bell, at least since school and university, in working life, and through the news, is really just symbolic reality. It's a construct. And then you ask yourself, does it have to be this way? So that's always the issue, that someone has programmed into our heads, into our brains, a symbolic reality that doesn't correspond to reality at all. From the perspective of today's meditation research, this is the topic of brain frequencies. But that's going too far. I just want to point that out to you. When we are children, our brains are still between 8 and 14 hertz. We are the creative people, the artists. We can tell really great stories off the cuff where you sometimes say the child is lying. No, it is alive. It is a symbolic realist. It takes us into its reality, which consists only of stories and lots of experiences. Then comes school. She's not that bad. Here you will, of course, learn formal operational thinking, i.e. conceptual thinking and abstract thinking. And the brain comes to the beta band, so the other one was alpha. That's around 14 to 30 hertz. This means you can study and work. That's enough for the system of symbolic reality. Since the meditation research, monks from Tibet, who the Dalai Lama then sent over as test subjects, have returned. We continue to ask, what is essential in human beings? This has a lot to do with our brain, with our nerve cells, and how they are synchronized. And now people like Richard Davidson, meditation researchers, neuroscientists, said, we thought the devices were broken, i.e. MRI, EEG. We measured hearing frequencies that we had never measured before. Presto, the Platonic cave shakes, light shines in. And again you can ask, why can they do that? They live it so primitively, and yet they are so stupid. They just want to be happy and enlightened. That has nothing to do with culture. It's just part of life. My goodness, they're really happy. They concentrate on what's important and are obviously smarter, measurable by their horn frequencies. So next we nudge into the gamma band, which is around 30 to 70 hertz. And if they live on gamma, the reality is different. But no one taught them at school because it's not important for the system. If you wanted them to be happy, you would of course give them an instruction manual for their brain at school and teach them how to regulate my brain so that I am not at the mercy of emotional states or racing thoughts before falling asleep. So from now on, if you live on gamma, you could deal with anxiety and depression in a flash, because you don't even have to pay expensive psychologists for long. We don't want to take away work, but sometimes they are happy when people get well quickly. Because now gamma, they have metacognition. That's what they call it now. They can watch themselves think. They recognize patterns, including faulty patterns. In a flash, they can correct them with very simple exercises, and they can even look over their shoulders as they really dig themselves into depression and say to themselves, oh, if I actively do that, I could also do the opposite. So you are not at the mercy of your head. Cheeky people like Vera Birkenbiel, Vera Felicitas Birkenbiel, say this is how brain owners differ from brain users. In this culture, I'll do it slowly, you can also look up the rest from Vera Birkenbiel on YouTube. So in this culture, it's enough if you're proud of your education and have a brain. Some mystics want to be brain users. In return, they give up some comfort and status and laugh at themselves because they are happy and don't have to suffer so much. So here we can already leave depression and anxiety behind us. And the good thing about the system is that so-called mindfulness-based therapies are now also on the rise, which fortunately use exactly that as a repair kit. I'm still waiting for the church to have this as standard. What use is it to you to know how Luther felt, or how unified theologians now deal with Bible texts, or what Christology means, or events in church history? Life is now. This is the difference between knowledge and transformative knowledge. The mystics said that anyone who knows a lot is like a horse, eats it in, comes out digested and changes nothing. Our example is the camel on a few ruminations until it becomes our flesh and blood, until it transforms us completely from within. Welcome to the Knowledge Society and not to the Transformation Society. That's not the end of it. Over 70 Hertz, so that's 1 Hertz, is 1 sine wave per second, waits transgamma. And there are completely other areas waiting for that. If you increase your brain speed accordingly, and you will learn this fairly quickly through exercises, you will notice that your perception of reality depends on your brain frequency. The more out of survival feelings you are, and the less you ruminate, the more you realize, wow, reality looks solid, but actually I'm a radio being and we live in a massive Wi-Fi. This happens often to people in love. They know what the next person will say next. Or there are also books like those by Diane Hennessy Powell with the stupid title Mobius Consciousness, but they document university research into so-called mystical abilities. That's the great thing about the book Mobius Consciousness. And she says that what mystics can do, this clairvoyance, is simply enough when people are lovingly connected to one another. The Wi-Fi is open there. And in that sense, for example, it's often mothers who tell me something like that. Yes, my daughter is in another city. A secretary once asked me, am I a witch? I know exactly what's wrong with my daughter, and then I call her and it's always true or something. So this heart connection, I tell these examples so you know this is culture for mystics, where people can live in a connection of the heart and are not plagued by feelings of struggle for survival and are not put in competition with each other from the outset by industry or society. If we're not better, they'll close us down and you'll lose your place or you'll get fewer resources allocated to you. Symbolic reality. The mystics say it is not necessary, damages us to our potential development. What I'm getting at is that what appears to be supernatural, i.e. the declaration itself, is actually a trick to keep normal people away from it, is supernatural. So if I told you that playing the piano is supernatural, or that singing a beautiful clean alto voice or a 4-part Bach chorale is supernatural, you wouldn't start so quickly. But when I say this is a skill, anyone can do it. And even crooked, shy people just pose like that. Yes, and the throat and stuff. We can do this. And so mystics see people and say, okay, maybe you're a little crooked and have lost your own voice and don't even know whether you're old or tenor now, because you always had to have a lisp in order to be recognized and to have a career. Yes, let's come first and see what your voice is like. There are now psychologists. What do you mean now? Abraham Maslow died in 1970, and that's a wonderful book. Every person is a mystic. And because I love my job at the university, I prefer to quote books instead of being too cheeky. So all I have to do is quote him, and he says that mysticism is just biological human nature fully developed. So with species-appropriate husbandry, if I take it that way, free-range farming instead of cage farming, and that they are not pitted against each other like fighting animals from the outset, and that shortages and distribution struggles are not the myth of society, and that it is not spread from the outset that humans are an evil in its essence. Homo homini lupus, so that's why we need a social contract and stuff. Yes, watch wolves. Not even they were looked at closely. They are very, very, very social animals. It would be nice if man were a wolf to men. So a lot of things here are man-made and are going wrong. And the mystic therefore tries to, let's say, keep the culture level a little away. If I were to say now, to leave behind or to leave behind, that is a state of war. People are being burned and stress is considered normal, but stress causes more deaths than traffic deaths or smoking. So this should be on every door in your office. Stress takes lives. 70% die from stress. Write this on your office door, just like the frightening pictures on cigarette packs. Imagine pictures of people dying of heart attacks, of diabetics, of, yes, I don't know, food addicts who somehow try to cope with it. We can never develop our potential under stress or under conditions of survival. In this respect, mystics try to stay away from all panicky topics and say to themselves that the most important thing is to concentrate on my being. And that, according to Meister Eckhart, is education at its core. We expose ourselves to the original image, in the sense that human beings become essential. If I have a core education in this sense, the most important educational competence for me would be that individuals are told what great beings they are, what they have in them. If they can grow up properly and freely, then they would have who have such respect for themselves and others. And that's always what the monks say, Christ in you, or receive every person as if Christ were coming. They see the archetype in every person, no matter how distorted it is. A culture then often uses the trick and says, this is supernatural, this is transcendent. When I started thinking about mysticism, that's still my blue book, Jesus' Prayer, New Mysticism, I also thought there was something like a parallel space, a transcendence. Meanwhile, I would say transcendent is a dynamic term. We also notice this in religious globalization, which is inherent in a culture. The ancestors in many African peoples or in China, this is transcendent to our culture, dead as mouse dead, because we don't perceive them. On the other hand, if you travel to Switzerland, where people grew up in rural conditions, they can tell you how they feel, that their husband was still present, and that they were completely sad when he died and witnessed it. But then he wasn't filled with such peace and love. It was only then that he felt it. The cats also went crazy at the time, and so on. So this is transcendence. The more jaded or multitasking and scattered we become, the less we perceive of ourselves and of reality. But stress and competition, the fight for survival, are supposed to be, that's the reality, you have to deal with that. Have fun. So a culture that has this potential built into children during their educational journey, that's all there is to it. They are something like dampen it in children. They are something like the seed. And from them a redwood forest will be built. Fire. And most people are proud when they end up becoming a hedge. This is also reflected in the synapses. They say, yes, that's not so bad. But children have a lot of dense networks, and what is not needed is dismantled, and that's okay. While I would say, my goodness, that shows that this form of education is stupid. People are half brain dead, and with that comes the fewer neurons and neural connections they have. The more they tend to feel depressed and anxious, the less confident they are. They can then be wonderfully controlled by the system. The human potential that individual mystics exemplify when it comes through is then considered fantastic, crazy, an invention, a fairy tale. Conversely, the mystics would say that this culture is a really bad fairy tale. Why are you playing these roles? I found it very exciting in my mystic research, as I became increasingly concerned with living contemporary Christian mysticism in the 20th century. We have Therese von Konnersreuth among the Catholics around 1920, who only ate one host per week. Light food has of course been completely trashed, and I always want to say that only with really specialists, so not every mystic eats light food, but it shows that we are a bioelectric system, and with the appropriate operating instructions, we wouldn't have to use the worst type of heating from our body system, so via carbohydrates, but we could initially live on very, very little on the food level. But when we're stressed, We're really like a completely poorly tuned engine, so we blow out almost everything and we get soot. Then we have Padre Pio, we were able to do bilocation and things like that. Then we have the Daskalos. Okay, it's not Christian mysticism in Cyprus. What I find funniest is that he materialized a bratwurst. This also annoys some of his students, as he could simply use such a great gift for entertainment. But now Christian mysticism, I think the Paisios only died in 1994. He could perceive from a distance. He could do so-called astral projection. That is, he could materialize himself in such a way that he could save himself from being run over in his youthful form on the other side of the monastery mountain. He could also cure people of cancer from a distance through a prayer that gave him authority. And he says, I'm just a little light here on Athos. There are even people living there, people who no longer need clothes, so-called snow people, who can also make themselves invisible at any time, and so on. All of these things came across my path, and then I started to ponder more and more, because it's not just in Christianity, but also in Yogananda, for example. These are abilities that are inherent in us as individuals. What are we left with? We resign ourselves to the veil of tears, and although this was considered medieval and nasty consolation and consolation, we project our unlived nature and potential onto an external divine one. We then worship that. The mystic says that when you take back this projection, you realize that the divine is your potential. In the original Christian mysticism, it was still in the 4th century, says Athanasius the Great, a bishop god became human so that you could be deified. Theopoia eistai. The Orthodox monks say that the goal of man is bios angelikos, or angelic life. So this is just a very low level of development. Evolution continues. That's the beauty, and it's not our fault. So to speak, it's ignorance, and everything is meant with kindness. So I don't have a conspiracy theory in the background, but rather this is the view of mystics. So it's about a fantastic potential that is inherent in each and every one of you as a human being, and we are much, much greater than we have ever been told. At the beginning of a life story in this culture, however, it is often the case that this greatness, this divine child in us, is not welcomed, but is made small, is formalized. As long as you can't do that yet, you don't have to have a say to fit in. Instead of, what do you need to develop your potential? An upbringing that uses praise and blame is particularly hard. This is classic behaviorism. This is rat psychology. With recognition and punishment, even Skinner, the inventor of rat psychology, says that you can even teach pigeons to play table tennis. Since school, we have been used to reacting to external guidance, as if that were the most important thing. You did that well, you did that badly. But you can only do that with people whose self-worth has been pretty much undermined because you don't tell them who they are. So human nature is great, and the mystics try to do what others only experience in a near-death experience. Luckily, this happened to me. They try to have this as a normal, permanent state if possible. And Maslow also says that anyone who has a spontaneous experience of unity while hiking, doing sports, through a love relationship, or simply really in nature, people experience the same thing that they suddenly say. It seems like scales fall from their eyes, or as if a fog were lifting. They feel connected to everything, they are filled with happiness without having to do anything, and then they suddenly know what the true values in life are. And he didn't deal with it for religious reasons, but Maslow just wanted to know what distinguishes particularly healthy people from the sick or averagely sick. And they all had a unity experience and described it that way. So if you deal with mysticism, you have the chance to become really healthy again because you are no longer living against your nature. Some people say that this punitive, i.e. blaming form of education sparks a civil war against themselves from an early age. I'm not good enough. I still don't measure up to the outside standard. What does the monk of the mystics rest within themselves? Habitare secum want to be at home? Many methods of so-called contemplation then trace the way in which we were torn apart and undo it. So mystics first start by analyzing where the brakes are installed in me. Who started this war? Do I want to continue it against myself? In doing so, they also seem to forego a lot of what the culture finds great. But for them, many of these values have become hollow. This is often found even in Christian parables. So from Jesus, who says there was a merchant and he collected precious pearls. But when he once found a particularly beautiful one, he sold everything he had to buy that one, or that thing, a treasure in the field. Someone finds a treasure there and now gives everything else to it. These are always the stories. They will then understand them, or that everyone will get the same pay in the end. The workers at the vineyard, the core is always, they discover the essence, the actual potential, and therefore forgo a lot of what the culture has. And then they can still decide, like in those old Zen stories, to go to the market and chop wood beforehand, and then go to the market and chop wood again after enlightenment. But then they do what someone else does out of obligation, or because they don't know anything better. Then they do it voluntarily and have a lot of fun doing it, for example, because maybe in addition to chopping wood, they now do everything in a playful way do with ease. You can leave it at any time. You can now also carve a funny faces on the wood or something like that in addition to chopping wood. And therefore the mystic's renunciation, or the fact that they practice so much, can be seen as rather sporting. Just like someone who says, I want to run a marathon, says to themselves, no, I'm going to put on extra pounds, I don't feel like it. What might it look like to be on this journey of discovery like this? Now again, this potential that is in each and every one of us, even as contemporary people. Someone is writing to me here who has his own channel. It's called Zen Riser. I started running daily in 2008 after reading the book Forever Young, the easy running program. Initially 20 to 40 kilometers a week, then 70 to 100 kilometers a week. And that was the happiest time, no matter the weather, perceiving nature, animals, bird, song in the flow, becoming one with nature, sun, wind, rain, feeling, and experiencing all of that. Clearing our heads of everything that concerns us is brought from outside on unpleasant topics, or memes about the so-called MSM, job, TV, newspaper, news. And get rid of all the ballast and only consume the things that are good for you and don't manipulate us negatively. I dealt intensively with questions of faith and came to the conclusion that there was a lot of valuable experience in the mysticism of Meister Eckhart, Rumi, Thich Nhat Hanh, and other great spiritual thinkers, as well as the Far Eastern considerations. Zen, Zazen, original Buddhism, Tao Te Ching, contains what is not tied to dogma and can really enrich our lives. I was able to share this insight when, one day in 2011, during one of my runs, I met a monk on a path through the forest who was meditating in the lotus position. He spoke to me, and in the course of the conversation, you quickly sensed that we had similar interests, that is, the monk and the current Westerner, that we had similar interests. So he told me about his journey to liberation from the attachments of our Western culture after traveling to India many years ago and devoting himself to Buddhism, studying Sanskrit, and reading the writings of the Upanishads. Since then, everything gradually fell away from him like a veil, and he decided to live homeless as a hermit and monk. Cool. He lived on a property nearby at the edge of the forest and invited me to tea. He was barefoot, and dressed in the simplest clothes. He ate a vegan diet based on what nature offered him. Wild and medicinal herbs, roots, nuts, fruit, grain. He grew himself nuts, fruit, grain, water, and butter. We then met sporadically every 4 weeks and exchanged a lot about a wide variety of topics in life, which had been and are ancient knowledge for a long time, including from the Weds, shamans, and others, which unfortunately was often overshadowed by our so-called Western culture and is, and partly largely forgotten. Spiritual knowledge, knowledge of nutrition, plants, and healing knowledge. His knowledge was enormous. He knew almost every plant and hardly encountered any on 2 hikes through nature. Overall, it was a very enriching experience and encounter that lasted 3 years, as I then moved away and we lost touch. I report these experiences because it is amazing what parallels monastic cultures and minimalism have, also in terms of the mindful perception and consciousness they carry. In contrast, becoming recognizable as enrichment instead of renunciation. It is again this renunciation of many things that culture initially offers, so it's enriching when you experience it from the inside, when we recognize the right focus and perspective. Unfortunately, it is also a fact that our so-called community of values and globalized culture is on a very questionable path in many areas, to put it mildly. I recognized this credo for myself around 2008. It is a blessing for our soul, our heart, and our spirit when they become aware of the illusionary world of our mind, whose ego often leads us by the nose, of their true nature and their limitlessness in everything. This requires unconditional openness and freedom of mind on all levels. Be still and know that you are everything. Nature has everything. If we treat everything carefully again, then we will recognize it. We will recognize what we need and, above all, what we don't need to be happy. Conscious exercise and nutrition. Conscious thinking then means living to the full. Out of the mass madness means into abundance, invasion of freedom and self-sufficiency. We want so much and need so little because abundance is already within us and in nature. We can rediscover them when we recognize the conditioned veils that have been thrown over us, when we lift and throw off these veils. The so-called lottery win is within you. If you want to be happy, be it. Basically, being in a good mood is the winning factor. I can fully confirm the result. So that's a very simple person who just woke up because of the way he did sports, cross-country skiing, being outside in nature, and then another encounter like that. So it doesn't always have to be the religious path. I get a lot of letters like this now, and I of course wish that the topic was about the church. And then you notice small differences between where mysticism lives and where it is still hidden. If I summarize Maslow's thesis that every person is a mystic, that's the name of the book again. For me, it's about peak experiences. And I would rename the word now. It's not about peak experiences, but about essential experiences. The summit is still far too modest. It is not enough if we have ecstatic experiences of happiness every now and then. That is inherent in our nature. Mysticism is therefore inherent in human biological nature. It is simply the project, becoming human. If you downgrade us like that, we naturally move like some aggressive monkeys or animals that are locked in a cage that is too small, and then attack each other or become depressed. Second, mystical experiences, according to Maslow, are commonplace and mundane. They can appear in sports, in love, in music, in dance. Quote Maslow, "Heaven is all around us. In principle, it is always open. Of course, such messages would also make sense from church pulpits." Then, how does he define peak experiences? Visit to heaven. Of course, he uses the old dualistic language on this side and beyond. Journey into the core of human beings is what I would much rather formulate now in order to abolish this false concept of transcendence. It is simply a stage of development that we realize or are too awestruck of, or our mind is so small that we don't believe we deserve it. Quote, visit to heaven. Peak experience, according to Maslow. Quote, the feeling that they had really seen the ultimate truth, the nature of things, the mystery of life, as if a veil had been pulled away. The word veil again. And according to Maslow, these essential experiences, as I say now, have a transformative effect. So it's not just that you're now full of additional knowledge and are proud of having read a book, but it's about the complete emotional shock that the values we have learned so far are not the ultimate at all, and that we could actually live completely differently. Instead of being transformative, I would even say that these experiences have a personalizing effect. And before that, there is a lot of reward and punishment, conditioning, learned knowledge, almost robotization, formalization of humans. Because society as a differentiated functional system naturally needs functioning ants. Where would we get there then? All lively, free people. Do they even want to work that much anymore? Do they even want to consume so much when they are no longer so unhappy with frustrating purchases, frustrating eating, frustrating trips, when they simply say, I'm sitting in my garden and think this is beautiful? Then, according to Maslow, this experience comes to us passively. This is almost the same as Meister Eckhart says, calmness, letting go, not doing so much. He says, let go, relax, and compare this basic attitude so that these experiences come to us with love and erotic experiences, and on the other hand, like urinating on the toilet. So don't do it. But we are homo faber here, and we are supposed to save the world and ethics. Sometimes I compare the news to majestics. In Asterix and Obelix, I think it's the mayor who always carries his shield and is afraid that the clouds will fall on his head. He always has to do something. In the meantime, I would even add the topic of deceleration to passivity. So much is being squeezed out now, even to so few, that it is of course an absolute stress factor, literally frenzy. And when I once lived in a tent in my own garden, instead of spending the night in a small house, i.e. camping in my own garden, that was adventure enough for a Berliner when I moved from Berlin to Kiel. And then the sentences just came to me, and there was a sentence in my head one morning, slowing down, the first snail storming my tent. Of course, for a Berliner, that's almost... Then Maslow says he calls it peak experience. I say essence experience again. What is our essence? Because we no longer need ethics from outside to be told what is right and wrong, but we are awake and conscious at the moment. And we have in us, we simply feel it from this core experience that life is about truth, beauty, liveliness, effortlessness, a playful attitude. So we are pretty self-sufficient and don't just find our happiness through relationships and recognition. We are ourselves. Every person is a treasure, an island, a world, a wealth. We are complete and everything goes pretty easily. These are core experiences regardless of whether one examines experiences of unity theologically or near-death experiences or even great philosophers, including Schiller, who wrote something about play, Ruisinger, Homo Ludens, Herbert Marcuse, then wrote something about playful people. So these are always the great works. They are works that focus on something from this area of human beings. What role does religion play now? I'd rather quote Maslow than comment. Maslow says organized religion can be thought of as an attempt to convey peak experiences or human essence experiences to those without peaks, or people who no longer know what they are like. To complicate matters further, he says this task often fell into the hands of those without summits. So summitless people now want to give summitless people the summit experience. And if possible with measures. Maslow also says that such a service has completely inadequate stimulants. A little singing, a little organ music, how is that supposed to lead to a peak experience? And that actually brings us back to understanding why Jesus tells the poor Pharisees, who try so hard to count the mint, that he says you are blind guides of the blind. So if people haven't trained their brains first to feel to what extent we live from the brain frequency, how do people who have simply completed a theology degree, who are then just full of knowledge, and those in their studies the essence experience was not made possible, how are they supposed to carry out such a demanding task now? Practical ways to do this, the main way, is that they recognize in many areas where they have been functionalized, they may be proud of their supporting functions in a system, but if they ask about the basic values, this system serves to give people this basic experience, to have these essential experiences. An educational career serves, what do I know, a superposition. Ultimately, the mystic tries on his way to become a free divine being again from a farm animal or human being. It is there for its own sake, no matter why. The rose is a rose for no reason. She's not proud of it. Wow, I am now a special breed and will stand and finish on the emperor's table. It's just there. It's blooming. And that is man. We don't have primary value as farm animals. The farmer believes that there is only the stable and the paddock because he grew up in captivity. And that is also Plato's theme in the parable of heights. The stable or cave dwellers believe that what they see is reality. They mistake the shadows for reality. And they have a cave society, even according to Plato, a cave science, a shadow science. A science, psychologists now also say that many psychological theories, if you look at attachment research, are based on generalizations from people with attachment disorders. Unfortunately, in this society, the way we grow up in this harsh environment, that's around 75%. And when mystics begin again with love mysticism exercises and eliminate these false patterns from the brain, even people with attachment disorders can build a secure bond within themselves again. And if these securely attached people, what is better, competition or altruism? Of course they would always say altruism and the like. So that's a completely different perspective. So if you just look at Homo hominilipus in the combative sense, he's simply an attachment disordered guy. And society parrots it. Then Maslow says that if we, well, he calls it peak experience, I say Plato also says, the truth would then shock the majority of this cave society so much that they would kill the messenger. That's not exactly healthy for Jesus. It didn't exactly serve his health on the face of it. With their mental exercises, mystics first study themselves, how they were transformed from an actually free, wild, living person into a useful person who languished in the stable and is happy when he has a large sugar beet or an extra one portion of feed can be earned in the stable. Or we could also use a circus seal as a comparison, which always has to earn its dried fish there or its frozen fish there. And instead he could also be bobbing along on the sandbank in the sea, and he's not proud, oh, I'm German, oh, I'm a Danish seal, or I can do the third ball trick now. That's the thing, he's just there, no matter why. And I have to use examples like these again to say that you are free beings. The bonds are mostly in your head, and when you grew up full of competition and fear, every person can discover this essence within themselves quite quickly. So it is this treasure in the field, or the pearl of great price, or the light of one's own essence, as they also describe it, with 3 exercises, 1 for the head, 1 for the heart, 1 for the hand. All 3 exercises initially serve to unleash or perceive the shackles that have been conditioned on us, so that we perceive reality in a much too narrow way and feel much too small and too lousy and too ugly. Essentially, it's something like this. I tried to develop a mysticism to go that seems as tough as in a monastery, but is also suitable for everyday Western life, and which can increasingly turn an everyday life full of stress and constraints into a lucky day. The core, to name one of the 3 exercises, is now really ancient monastic tradition, which the Christians have also adopted, that they try to repeat a sentence or a word non-stop as much as possible. In terms of content, most of them took God's name, Jesus Christ, but in terms of content, it should be something that connects them to this level of being, of their warning reality. So, for example, I am pure light, or I am clear consciousness, or my essence is love. And just like an advertising message or political mantra, this sentence is increasingly getting into her unconscious. The other one only got in through penetration. And so they clock their brain through this exercise that seems so pointless. From this maximum of 30 hertz all the way up to 70 hertz, they get to gamma. It's like non-stop Zen. And everyday Western life has so many distractions. At the beginning, it's all about riding a bike, and now it's deep sand, pedaling, and going through it. So just kind of keep the focus and actually stay on track. If they do the exercise faithfully for a very, very long time, day in and day out, they will increasingly have a jingle like that, and they will become observers of themselves in witness consciousness. And from there you can pick up patterns. So that's kind of an exercise. Again, from my tent experiment, I gave up. The first frost in the morning was on my tent canvas. It was too harsh for me. But I began to wake up to beautiful texts, and one was clear light. I am colorless like the water, and reflect the ground over which I flow, and the colors of the sky. What I mean by that is they are truly pure consciousness, and we are identified with many but what others have seen in us. From the mystic's point of view, they do not need anyone to constitute their identity. They are already themselves, and many have an identity here in the West that they say to what others see in them, that is me. And because different people judge us and want something different from us, we also have something crumbling, and that is the ego. And the mystics want them to realize through self-observation that these are all set pieces from the outside, and they are afraid that if I let go of that now, then I will be nothing. On the contrary, you will notice that you are clear light, colorless, pure like water, with a beautiful shine. And people crash into this level when they leave their brain memory behind, so to speak, when they die, and enter this area. And that is her true self. This is the split personality, so to speak, a positive schizophrenia, that they worship something on the outside that they are. In this respect, when light appears to them, they say, "That is me." Yes, as far as the original timeline was concerned, it was a pleasure for me.